My husband spoke French with his mother every time she called. I would be standing right there in our own kitchen, and they would slip into it like pulling on a coat. Easy, familiar, deliberately exclusive. He would turn slightly away from me, drop his voice, and the words would flow between them like water finding its level. I would go back to whatever I was doing, stirring the soup, folding a dish towel, pretending I didn't notice. What he never knew, what I kept to myself for 27 years, was that I understood every single word. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a neighbourhood that was half English, half French. My best friend through elementary school was a girl named Odette, and I spent so many afternoons at her family's kitchen table that a mother eventually started speaking to me in French without thinking. By the time I was 12, I could follow a full conversation. By 15, I could hold one. I was never fluent the way a native speaker is fluent. I had an accent. I reached for words sometimes, but I understood. Idioms, tone shifts, the particular cruelty that hides inside polite phrasing. I understood all of it. When I met my husband in the autumn of 1986, I was 32 years old. I was working as a medical transcriptionist for a group of family physicians in Barrie. I had my own apartment, a small savings account at TD Bank, and a cat named Wilfred who slept on my feet every night. I was, by most measures, doing fine. He was introduced to me at a friend's Thanksgiving dinner. His name was Glenn. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair just starting to silver at the temples, and he had a way of giving you his full attention when you spoke that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. I was not naive. I had dated before, but there was something about Glenn that felt settled, substantial, like he had already figured out who he was. At 32, that seemed like exactly what I wanted. His mother was Quebecois. She had grown up in Trois-Rivières and moved to Ontario when she married Glenn's father, but she had never fully made peace with the English language. She used it when she had to. She preferred not to. When Glenn and I got engaged, she smiled at me warmly and said in careful, accented English that she hoped I would be very happy. Then she turned to Glenn and said, in French, that she hoped he knew what he was getting into. I kept my face perfectly still. I set down my tea. I said nothing. That was the moment I made the decision, though I didn't frame it that way at the time. I told myself I was being generous. I told myself that a woman's private comments to her son didn't need to become a confrontation. I told myself a lot of things over the years. But the truth, the thing I only admitted to myself much later, was that I was afraid of what I might find out. And some part of me decided that not knowing officially was safer than knowing. So I let them have their language. I let it be the thing they shared that I supposedly couldn't enter. I watched Glenn's expression shift when his mother called, that particular loosening around the jaw, the way his shoulders dropped, and I made dinner or read my book or took Wilfred for a walk down the street. We married in June of 1987 at a small church in Barrie with 40 guests and a reception at the Legion Hall afterward. It was a good wedding. I remember being genuinely happy. The early years were fine. Better than fine. Glenn worked in commercial real estate, and he was good at it, patient and persistent in the way the work requires. I kept transcribing. We bought a house in Innisfil, a modest, semi-detached, with a backyard that backed onto a ravine. We talked about children. We tried for a while, and when it didn't happen, we grieved it quietly and separately, the way some couples do, each of us carrying our portion of that loss without quite finding the language to share it. His mother's calls came every Sunday. They had a rhythm to them, those calls. Glenn would answer in English if I was nearby, exchange a few pleasantries, and then move to the other end of the house, or step outside, or close the bedroom door. I noticed. I always noticed, but I had built such a careful architecture of not noticing that I could walk past it without looking directly at it. What I heard, when I couldn't help but hear, was not dramatic. It was small. That was almost the worst part. She called me Lautra sometimes, the other one. Not his wife, not by name, just Lautra. Once, in the first year, I heard him say, standing in the hallway thinking I was still in the shower, that I was trop Freud, too cold, that I didn't understand what family meant, the way they understood it. I stood behind the bathroom door and looked at my reflection in the mirror and thought, I understand exactly what family means. I understand what it costs. I said nothing. The years accumulated. Glenn became more successful, which was good for our finances and not always good for our marriage. He started making the significant financial decisions without consulting me in any real way. And I want to be clear about what I mean by that, because I know how it sounds. He wasn't hiding money, not at first. It was subtler than that. The joint account covered household expenses. The investment accounts, the business accounts, the property he bought as a rental, those were in his name. He would mention them in passing. He would show me statements if I asked, but asking felt like an accusation, so I stopped asking. I told myself it was his income. I told myself he was managing it sensibly. I told myself that if something happened to him, I would figure it out. I was 60 years old before I understood what I had actually given away. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in March of 2019. We had been married for 32 years. Glenn's mother had flown in from Quebec City. She had moved back years ago after his father died and was staying with us for a week. She was 81, slower now, her French softer and more deliberate. I had always been polite to her. Cordial. She had always been polite to me in return. We had reached, over the decades, a kind of peaceful coexistence, the way neighbouring countries sometimes do. I had gone upstairs to change after dinner. I came back down to get a glass of water and stopped in the hallway because I could hear them in the living room. Not raised voices, just the low, even murmur of French, and I recognised the register of a serious conversation. I stood still. I know how that sounds, but I stood still. Glenn's mother was saying that she was worried. She used the word inquiet, which I have always found to be a particularly loaded word in French. It doesn't just mean worried, it means unsettled. It means something is wrong at a level that keeps you awake. She was worried, she said, about what would happen to everything he had built. She asked him, directly, whether my name was on anything. There was a pause. Glenn said no. He said it simply, without defensiveness, the way you state a fact that you have already made peace with. His mother made a sound, not quite satisfaction, but close. She said that was wise. She said that when it came time, he should make sure it was handled carefully. She used the phrase, de ton vivant. While you were still living, and I understood that they were talking about estate planning, about what would happen to his assets, about me. I walked back upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at my hands. 32 years. I had been married for 32 years, and my name was on the house. I knew that. We had bought it together. But I didn't know what else I was on. I didn't know what the investment accounts held. I didn't know about the rental property beyond that it existed. I had trusted that this would work itself out, the way I had trusted so many things to work themselves out. And I was sitting on the edge of my bed at 60 years old, realizing that trust is not a financial strategy. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, after Glenn left for the office and his mother was still asleep, I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down everything I knew about our finances. It took less than 10 minutes. The list was embarrassingly short. I want to say I did something dramatic after that. I want to say I confronted Glenn over breakfast, or called a lawyer that same morning, or told his mother exactly what I thought of the conversation I had overheard. I didn't do any of those things. What I did was quieter and, in the end, more useful. I made an appointment with a financial advisor, not ours. We had a shared one I had met maybe 3 times, but a new one, a woman named Anita who worked independently out of an office in Barrie and had been recommended by a colleague. I told Glenn I had a dental cleaning. I drove to Barrie and I sat across from Anita and I told her the truth. I was 60 years old. I had been out of the workforce for 15 years since taking early retirement from transcription work, and I didn't know what I owned. She didn't flinch. She had clearly heard this before. She explained what I was entitled to know as a spouse under Ontario family law. She explained the difference between family property and what could be designated otherwise. She explained what a marriage contract could do and what it couldn't, and she asked whether we had signed one. We hadn't. She said that was relevant. Over the next several months, I educated myself in a way I had never thought to do before. I requested copies of tax returns. As a spouse, I was entitled to these, and Glenn, to his credit, handed them over without much comment, though he seemed slightly puzzled by my sudden interest. I made another appointment with Anita. I consulted once with a family lawyer, not because I had decided to leave, but because I needed to know where I stood. Here is what I found out. Under Ontario's Family Law Act, spouses are entitled to an equalisation of net family property upon separation. The rental property, the investment accounts, the business interests, these would factor in. I was not as unprotected as that conversation had made me feel, but I was also not as informed as I should have been. Those are two different things, and I had confused them for 30 years. I also found out something else, something smaller and more personal. Glenn had written a will 7 years earlier that I had never read. He had told me, vaguely, that it was taken care of. I had nodded and gone back to making dinner. The will left the bulk of his estate to his nieces and nephews, his sister's children, with a provision for me that amounted to the value of the house and a small annuity. It was not nothing. It was also not what a 32-year marriage looked like to me. I asked him about it on a Tuesday evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table after supper. I told him I had been thinking about estate planning and would like to understand what our current arrangements were. I kept my voice even. I had practiced keeping my voice even. He was surprised, not defensive, initially, just surprised in the way that people are surprised when you ask about something they've decided you don't need to think about. He walked me through it. The will, the account, the rental property. He was patient about it. He spoke to me the way you might speak to someone who has asked you to explain something technical, competently, and with a slight air of doing them a favour. I listened. When he finished, I said that I thought we should see a lawyer together to update things. I said I would like both our names on the investment accounts. I said I would like to understand, going forward, what we had and how it was structured. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked where this was coming from. I thought about that March evening. I thought about the word inquire and the phrase de ton vivant and the sound his mother made when he said no. I said it was coming from 32 years of not paying attention to something I should have. He didn't argue. I think he knew, somewhere underneath the surprise, that I was right. We did see a lawyer. We did restructure. It took several months and a few uncomfortable conversations, and one evening where Glenn said with real bewilderment that he had never meant to shut me out of anything, that he had only been trying to manage things efficiently, and I believed him. I believed that he believed that. I also believed that good intentions and a signature on a document are not the same thing, and that I had spent too long confusing the two. I never told him about the French. I have thought about that choice many times since. Whether I should have told him, whether the honesty of it would have changed something, cleared some air that had been stale for decades. Maybe. But it also felt, by the time I understood everything, like the least important part of the story. What his mother had said was not the wound. The wound was that I had heard something true, that my name was on nothing, and I had gone back upstairs and gone to bed, because confrontation had always frightened me more than silence. I had spent 32 years practicing a kind of strategic deafness, telling myself it was graciousness, and what I had actually been doing was making myself invisible in my own life. I am 66 now. Glenn and I are still married. That's not the ending people expect, I know, but it is the true one. We are different now than we were before that October conversation. Not dramatically different, but honestly different. He asks my opinion before making financial decisions. I read the quarterly statements. We see a fee-only financial planner together twice a year. These are not romantic gestures. They are the ordinary furniture of a partnership that works. His mother died 2 years ago in the winter in Quebec City. I flew out with Glenn for the funeral. At the reception afterward, his sister said something to me in French, something kind, something about how much it had meant to their mother that Glenn had someone steady. I answered her in French. The look on Glenn's face was something I will keep for a long time. He didn't say anything right then. Later that night, back at the hotel, he asked me how long I had understood. I told him the truth. All of it. The neighborhood in Sudbury, Odette's kitchen table, his mother's phone calls, March of 2019. He sat with that for a while. Then he asked what his mother had said that evening in the living room. I told him that too. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said that she hadn't been wrong to worry, only wrong in what she'd been worried about. He said that I was the one who had held everything together, that he had always known that, and that he was sorry it had taken this long for his behavior to catch up with what he knew. It was not a perfect apology, but it was a real one. I have been a dental transcriptionist, a homemaker, a woman who stood in hallways listening to conversations she was supposed to be excluded from. I have been louter to a woman who never quite accepted me, and I allowed that to be true for longer than it needed to be. I am still figuring out what to do with all of that. But I think about something my mother used to say back in Sudbury when I was young. She would say that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was to make herself comfortable in someone else's idea of who she was. I was comfortable for a very long time. I am not anymore, and it turns out that is not the loss I thought it would be. I think about Odette's kitchen table a lot these days. A small room, mismatched chairs, her mother speaking French without thinking about it because I was just there, just part of the afternoon. I didn't know at 12 years old that I was building something I would need 50 years later. That's how it works, I think. The things we learn quietly, without agenda, turn out to be the things that save us. What happened in my marriage was not a single betrayal. It was a long accumulation of small surrenders, most of them made by me, most of them made by me, most of them made willingly. I handed over the financial decisions because it felt easier. I stayed out of the accounts because asking felt like distrust. I listened to conversations I was supposed to be excluded from and said nothing, because saying something required a kind of courage I hadn't yet developed. None of that was Glenn's fault alone. That's the part I had to sit with, and it wasn't comfortable. There's a cause to every effect, and the effect in my life was a woman at 60 who didn't know what she owned. The cause wasn't a cruel husband. It was a habit of making myself smaller than I needed to be, dressed up as patience and grace. I had been so careful to seem easygoing that I had actually become invisible to Glenn, to his mother, and in some ways, to myself. When Glenn said he had never meant to shut me out, I believed him. I also believed that good intentions don't protect you. Only knowledge does. Only paying attention does. The intelligence I needed wasn't complicated. It wasn't about becoming a financial expert or a lawyer. It was about deciding that my own life was worth understanding. Anita, sitting across from me in that office in Barry, didn't treat me like I was naive. She treated me like someone who had arrived late to a conversation and just needed to be caught up. That's what it was. I had the capacity all along. I just hadn't decided to use it. And then there was the question of staying. People ask that sometimes when I tell this story. Why did I stay? I stayed because leaving wasn't the point. The point was to stop disappearing. Those are two different things. Glenn and I rebuilt something. Not dramatically, not overnight, but genuinely. He asks now. I read the statements now. We sit across from the same financial planner twice a year, and we both speak up. It is not a romantic picture. It is an honest one, and I have come to value honesty far more than romance. The steadiness it took to walk into that financial advisor's office, to ask the questions I had avoided for decades, to sit across from Glenn at our kitchen table and say what I needed without flinching. That steadiness didn't come from nowhere. It came from finally deciding that I was worth the discomfort, that my future was worth a difficult conversation, that the cage, as I said that night, had a door. I just had to be willing to open it. I am not the woman I was at 32. I am not even the woman I was at 60. I am the woman who stood in a hallway in March and understood exactly what was being said and decided, finally, to do something about it. That decision was the most important one I ever made, not because of what I found out, because of what I became in the making of it.